Good evening. Welcome to Lincoln Theater. My name is Christina Belknap, and I am the executive director here. And I am so thrilled to see so many people. Tonight, we are talking about the amazing Damariscotta River, and it is the final talk in our new free Talking Aquaculture in Maine series. And I'm hoping we'll continue it next summer, so please keep an eye out because I would love to see all of you again. I want to thank the Island Institute for partnering with us on bringing this event to the community and also sponsoring the event. Also the Shuck Station over in Newcastle. If you haven't eaten there, I just had their fish tacos and they are fantastic. So please consider going and having a meal there. There is a table in the lobby that the Island Institute has some information. If you're interested in learning more on your way out the door, I encourage you to take a look at that. And tonight we have a very special host who wears many hats, one of which happens to be my husband. But tonight he is the director of the Center for Marine Economy at Island Institute. Please join me in welcoming Sam Belknap.
Thank you so much, Christina, and thank you all for coming. It's amazing to look out and see so many faces. And I would just like everyone to note, my wife took ownership of me in public, so it's a proud moment for me. But again, I am so thrilled to see so many of you coming today to join us on this exploration of the river and its connection to oysters and aquaculture. We have the privilege of bringing some of the most influential folks involved in things on the river with us today. And I am lucky enough in my daily work to get to work with these amazing folks, and I'm so glad that we get to spend time with them together today. So if I could introduce Sarah Gladu from Coastal Rivers Conservation Trust, Smokey McKeen from Pemaquid Oyster Company, and Brendan Parsons from the Shuck Station and Blackstone Point Oysters. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and thank you all.
Thanks, Sam.
So, Sarah, you and I were talking a little bit before dinner about what you were up to today, some of the amazing programming that you were involved in with some kids up at Coastal Rivers.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more about what you do and how you got into oysters and aquaculture?
Sure. So I am the Director of Education and Community Science with Coastal Rivers, which is a land trust that also has a robust education program, and we do a lot of water quality, other environmental monitoring in the region, both on salt and fresh water. And so today I was actually running around most of the day with some children, and they got to see some squid, and they got to hold the squid, and they got to do all sorts of things. But what we're really trying to do is connect people to the place. And one of the ways we do that is through our oyster gardening program. And I know some people in the audience have been part of that program, but we actually somebody up here has been part of that as well. And so we teach people to grow oysters for their own use. So it's not for commercial use necessarily, although they might go that direction. But it's really to learn the hands-on part of how do you grow oysters, and also how, what's it like to be on the water or in the water or around the river, and what can you learn from it?
Yeah, it's so great that you're able to connect the youth and adults from the community to the river and the amazing things that are happening therein, oysters included. So Smokey, you've been a founder of Pemaquid Oyster Company, one of the first oyster companies on the river. Tell us a little bit more about your role and how you came to be an oyster farmer.
Well, it was we had no idea we were starting a business as such. It was more of an experiment, an environmental experiment. But two of my partners, who are still partners in the company, Carter Newell and Chris Davis, were studying at the Darling Center back in the 1980s. And one of their professors, Professor Herbert Haidu, had been studying oysters for many years and suggested to them that they try growing the native oyster. because prior to that time in the 80s, in the late 70s, there was a kind of a wave of oyster farming in Damariscotta and in some other estuaries in the area to grow the European oyster, we call the Ballon oyster, or the European flat. And they had disease issues, they had cold water issues, they had technology issues, shall we say, and marketing issues. And so all of the companies that started growing Ballons eventually failed, except for one, which eventually switched to growing the native oysters. About the same time, we started also growing native oysters, Crest Austria Virginica. And so, you know, after a few years, it kind of started to gel, and we started to find out people liked our product, and it sort of evolved into a business, and then it evolved into an industry.
That's great. Well, you certainly have delicious oysters, Smokey, so thank you for starting it. Brendan, you are a relative newcomer to the space. You and I both share Damariscotta roots, so we have a deep appreciation from this space, but what brought you back to this place, and what got you involved with oysters and aquaculture?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, having grown up here, been around aquaculture, oyster farming at a young age, not really knowing much about it, seeing Smokey a lot, hard to miss him. And I first dipped my toes into aquaculture in high school. I worked for John Sheldon, and he was a character. I think that's kind of part of being in the industry. And so I worked for John Sheldon off of Route 1. And I wouldn't say like I loved it as a high school kid. You know, you're waking up at like 6 and going out there, and that was a tough lease because you had to. Everything was on the bottom, so you had to like fish for it with your feet. And so that was my introduction, and it was great, very memorable summer. After that, I worked for a catering company. I worked for Larry Polino, and I was shucking oysters at like weddings and other events throughout the Mid-Coast area. And then I started my first business in 2015 called the Shuck Shack, BP Shuck Shack down in Portland. And that was me converting an old Oscar Mayer food cart into an oyster cart and slinging oysters at the peak of summer down in the Old Port. And that was very fun, a nice challenge because you were just convincing random strangers off of the busy Old Port area to eat an oyster. And it was successful, and we had a couple of those, and then, started the restaurant in 2017. When I started the oyster farm, Blackstone Point, in 2016. That was the same year I did the program with Sarah Gladu, and that was very informative, and that kind of rekindled, working on the water and really recognizing how important the industry is here, and then it's grown into what it is today.
Well, we're certainly glad you brought your business back. Was it a hard sell to sell oysters to folks out of a cart on the streets of Portland?
Yeah, it took you had to be really confident in your product. And so it was really easy for me because I was like coming up here each day or every other day and grabbing, oysters straight from the farmers, having that connection, and also being able to tell that story to the customer, kind of making that, connection a little more intimate. And then shucking oysters for them right there, seeing me pull it out of the ice. So it took a little bit of coaxing, but it was rewarding. It was good.
Great. So you mentioned the story. One of the stories I think would benefit everyone joining us today who may or may not know how oysters are actually grown on the river. Could I ask the three of you to briefly walk through, what does it take to grow an oyster? Smokey, maybe we start with you and the hatchery side, or...
Yeah. Well, sometimes people ask, when you first explain what's involved, they say, well, that sounds like a lot of work. And I have a friend who was involved in mussel aquaculture, and he says, why do you think they call it work? That's the word for it, I guess. But the other question that gets brought up is, how many times do you handle each oyster? Well, that's a really tough one to answer, but I'm guessing at least 100 times before the oyster's on your dinner plate, but not individually handling each oyster, because of course when you start with the oysters from the hatchery, or even if you're in the hatchery, working in the hatchery, there's millions of oysters that you're dealing with, and obviously you don't count each one and you don't handle each one by its handle. You operate out of a big container and you extrapolate how many oysters you have. So The hatchery, you spawn the oysters in the late winter, early spring in a hatchery, and you basically fool the oyster into thinking it's time to reproduce. So you bring it in from the cold ocean water in late winter and slowly heat the water, slowly feed the oysters. As the water warms up, as the oyster acclimates to the warmer water, they're ready to feed, and you grow algae in the hatchery to feed the oysters, which is the trickiest part, I think, of the hatchery work, is to keep enough food on hand to feed the animals. And then there's a lot of grading, there's cleaning of tanks, there's a lot of work involved. We ran a hatchery for 4, 5, 6 years over in the Wabanaki River, Muscogee Bay, and nobody liked working in the hatchery, really. We all would prefer to be out on the river, so we let the hatchery part of the operation go after a few years. But then you take the oysters to the river. I get my seed when they're 2.5 millimeters in size. So we bought 2 million oysters this spring, and it was about 13 quarts of volume. So they're literally the space between my fingers and my thumbs. We grow them in a couple of systems that are at the Schooner Landing Marina. We have a system of bottle upwellers. Maybe you've seen them. If you look over the railing from the restaurant, you'll see this kind of Rube Goldberg contraption that my partner Chris Davis put together, made of plumbing parts from Damariscotta Hardware, and some acrylic tubes, and we pump water from the river through the tubes and out the top of the tube back into the river. And the oysters, the more water that passes the small animals, the more food they can consume. They go from the bottle upwellers to what's called a flupsy, a floating upweller, where there's bigger containers that hold larger numbers of oysters. As the oysters get bigger, they increase in volume. They double in size every couple of days, essentially. They go from the upwellers to the farm, to floating cages. Today we sent out, 150,000 animals from the upwellers out to the farm, and they go into floating bags, plastic bags with floats on them, and we flip the bags every once a week to keep the bags clean. They grow. There's a lot of different ways of growing oysters, and there's different types of bags and different types of gear. My farm has always bottom planted oysters, so we grow them in bags until they're about the size of a silver dollar, and then we spread them on our lease. So we have about 18 acres of bottom lease, and you don't see the oysters at that point because they're on the bottom of the river. They're not in cages, they're not fenced in. We call them free range oysters. They choose not to leave the farm. But so they grow on the bottom for about a year, and then they're ready to start to harvest. And we drag them back up with a lobster boat that's rigged for dragging. It has a gallows frame on the stern, an A-frame that has hydraulic pistons that bring the frame forward and aft. We have a hydraulic winch and a chain sweep drag that's an iron frame with a bag underneath made of chain that's about so big. And we go out with a 3-man crew now and drag oysters for 4 or 5 hours twice a week.
Sounds like a lot of work.
Why do you think they call it work, Sam?
So Brandon, when you took me out on the river the other day to see your farm, you mentioned a couple other ways other than bottom planting that you're growing oysters. Could you talk a little bit about those techniques?
Yeah, so we do some bottom planting as well. We're still a new farm. It kind of takes a little bit longer to really get a good bed on the bottom. So we have placed a little more emphasis at the beginning of our journey to surface culture. So we are growing them in oyster grow cages. And then we also have a new growing technique this year called the Zapco, and that is in the subtidal area, and that is pretty much a rebar staple in the water with a tube, 3 tubes on the staple, and it rises and drops with the tide. You heard Smokey mention flipping the bags once a week in order to promote a certain shape and also mitigate marine growth. With the tubes tumbling twice a day, we get that without the labor, and at low tide they're out of the water, so the fouling is minimal, if any. So that's been beneficial. We just implemented that this year. We've seen our seed, we put our baby oysters in there, and we've seen some really great shape coming out of those, but we haven't really harvested any of them yet. So excited to see how that goes. And then the more common one, which anyone that's seen or has boated on the river, would be the oyster grow cages, which is a metal gauge, like lobster gauge cage with 2 plastic pontoons and caps on each end on this photo right here. And we have 6 slots in them for 6 bags. And we can either grow out baby oysters in it, depending on the mesh size of the bag, or market oysters. And they grow a little bit quicker on the surface, which is nice, but it also requires more handling. The other pros of growing on the surface, you have a higher survival rate, and you can access it quicker too. Sometimes dragging can be a little bit, you're designating a whole day just for dragging a finding product where you can just kind of zip out to the cage and grab it. The cons of growing it on the surface is, more initial cost. Each cage costs right around $300. So, that can definitely add up. And another con is the fouling. As with marine growth in the peak of summer with all the food, you get a lot of biofouling. This cage can weigh probably 125, 150 pounds, clean. And then when it's fouled up, these things can definitely weigh well over 200 pounds. And so when you have a couple hundred of those or even more, that can definitely be back-breaking work, so definitely have to stay on top of it. They grow quicker, but that can be also a con because sometimes you're not getting as aesthetic oyster. I think whenever you're growing it on the bottom, you can really get a really pristine, hard-shell oyster that Pemaquid is known for. And that's kind of what I think of a Maine oyster, a nice coveted large, hard,
Deep cup.
Deep cup. And so, yeah, it's different growing techniques produce different oysters, and it's nice to have a well-rounded crop too. It's nice to have stuff on the bottom and on the top because now you've differentiated your product. You have kind of an easier way to sell oysters, having 2 products now. But yeah, there's pros and cons to everything.
Great. So Sarah, you're also growing oysters at Coastal Rivers.
That's right.
Can you talk a little bit about how you're connecting these techniques to the broader community with your community oyster gardening program?
Sure. So we're on a totally different scale. We have very small sites, and we invite 10 participants every year to come and grow oysters, every other year to come and grow oysters with us. And so we buy some slightly larger seed from, actually some quite a bit larger seed,
yeah.
from Smokey. So we let him start it and do all the hard work and keep all the babies really safe and in good shape. And then we buy the seed when it's big enough that we can make a few mistakes and we'll be okay. So we go ahead and we put our seed in bags, but instead of growing them on the surface or right on the bottom, we actually have these rebar trestle tables. And this is how they're grown in France in some of the near shore environments. And we can walk, we do have a site that we can walk right out to our bags, and we put our oysters right into those bags on the trestle tables. And we tend them there as needed. So whenever there's biofouling there or we have any kind of issue, we need to walk right out into the intertidal zone and tend our oysters. And when it's time to harvest, we don't have far to go. So we do also have another small site out near Dodge Point. And we try to finish our oysters off there. So we do require a boat for that purpose. But and it's really about getting the people who are involved learning about the industry. So they go in and we visit a hatchery, we visit some farms, we talk to people who are running restaurants and find out what the implications are for the community and how oysters are integrated into this community in a really interesting way. And we go and visit Brooks Trap Mill, which is in Thomaston, and that's where a lot of our gear comes from. So the people who are actually buying and selling the gear, but also creating a lot of the gear come from a place like that. And that's another part of our communities here, and it's really interesting to learn about.
It's amazing to see that the infrastructure that has been here to support the lobster fishery, how that has been repurposed, and those companies have expanded their business to build oyster and aquaculture gear as well. It's just such a fascinating connection.
Brooks Trapp saw quite a few years ago that there would be a market developing for oyster aquaculture gear, and they've really pivoted into that. I mean, they still build lobster traps and serve the lobster community, but they make a lot of the equipment that we use, and some of it's custom made for us even.
That's great. Wonderful. So we've talked a lot about oysters today and how they're grown on the river, but this isn't the first time oysters have been here. Can you bring us back in time? Maybe we'll start with you, Sarah. Bring us back in time and talk about the deep historical connection and prehistorical connection that oysters have to this river.
Yeah, it's definitely prehistoric. So 12,000 or more years ago, the ancestors of today's Wabanaki people have worked throughout this landscape. But the oysters in this immediate estuary weren't really flourishing until about 3,000 years ago, related to climate and related to water quality conditions and also temperature probably of the water here. And so starting about 3,000 years ago, up until about 1,500 years ago, Native people were coming here. They were eating oysters in some parts of the estuary and other parts of the so above town, north of town, they were eating oysters and some quahogs, and you'll find those in the middens that are those ancient historic sites where people congregated on the shores and they ate oysters and they smoked oysters, and so there's some sites that are north of town, but the sites south of town are all clam middens, and so it's a different resource. But at the time, that's what was the estuary and the habitat was allowing for growth of these animals, and so what conditions warranted. So people were making use of them, and the middens, the Glidden and Whaleback, are two of the biggest middens on the East Coast, and so they're really phenomenal. And they were much bigger than they are today because the colonists came and they actually used a lot of the shell for fertilizer, for chicken feed because it makes the eggshells harder. So it's not, but if you go down there, there are some historic photographs and you can see what the site might have looked like, and also the factory before it burned. There's some images of the factory and so forth that was there.
Great.
Yeah.
One of the really interesting things I think about the story of the middens is that the archaeologists who studied it 100 years ago looked at the vertical cut. A lot of the middens are right on the bank of the river, so you can actually still see the vertical pile. And the top, well, should I start at the bottom or the top?
I don't know.
The bottom pile was made somewhere between 3,000 and 2,000 years ago. And it's a large pile of oysters. This is the case in more than one of the middens. And then there's a layer of humus that represents maybe 100, maybe 200 years of organic material piling up on top of the shell pile. And that means nobody piled any oysters there for 100 or 200 years, and leaves and things accumulated and composted on top of the pile. And then there's a second pile that represents a period of maybe 2,000 years ago to 1,500 years ago or something. And then there's another pile of organic material that gathered on top of that pile, and yet a third pile of shell on top of that. So the latter pile were the Wabanaki people that were here when the Europeans settled the area. The second period was, they believe, was the red paint people, who archaeologists don't know a great deal about because there was nobody to interview. There was no oral history to record. But they do know that they buried the dead with red ochre painted on their bodies, and they're known as the red paint people among the archaeologists. The original pile of shells, they know nothing about the people. They don't know who they were, where they came from, where they went, but they know that they ate oysters. And so that's pretty interesting. And apparently what happened to the oysters, the last group of people eating oysters, was that when the Europeans came and settled the area, they immediately started cutting timber to build ships and build houses, and dumped sawdust into the estuary, which smothered what was left of the oyster beds. Also, at the same time, maybe a little earlier than that, the Gulf Stream pulled away from the Maine coast, and the water actually got colder for a period of time, and it got too cold for the oysters to reproduce well. So unfortunately, we're now seeing the reverse trend. The water has warmed up The only good part of that is that the oysters are again reproducing, and there's a native population of what we call wild oysters in the vicinity of the farms in the intertidal zone. So if you live in the upper part of the river and have waterfront property, you can probably go down to the shore and gather a couple of dozen oysters for dinner. And they're not escaped from the farm. Some people think they swam away, but they're produced, they're spawned from the farmed oysters.
I brought these out today because this one may be prehistoric. It's quite, as Smokey pointed out earlier, it's pretty narrow. It could be 30 or 40 years old, and it's compared to, you know, sort of a standard shell that you might find today. It's pretty impressive. So they can grow for a long time. They're pretty amazing animals, very rugged and.
So you can put this one. There's the size of the oysters we're harvesting now.
So this might be 2 years.
This might be 2 or 3 years, and then here's another year of growth, another year, another year, another year. So this might be a 20 or 25-year-old oyster at the time it was consumed.
Wow, that's incredible. So, Smokey, you mentioned briefly that the oyster aquaculture isn't just benefiting the community through like the oyster businesses and things like that, but it's also helping to restore the river and bring back a population that was wiped out through land use challenges. Sarah, I know Coastal Rivers is doing some work on water quality and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of water quality and some of the challenges facing folks like Brendan and Smokey and yourself growing oysters?
These guys know it firsthand. Yeah. So we do collect water quality data, and we talk to folks that are out and about on the river and talk about what they're encountering and so forth. But certainly water quality is, as the history points out, it's very important. You know, and it's important not only to oysters but to everything else out there as well. So it's imperative, actually, that we pay attention to the water quality. And as we have more and more people in the region, we have more nutrients entering the water. We have more erosion issues where people are clearing banks. We have overboard discharge units, which can cause issues sometimes. There are a number of, you know, we have changing climate. There's a whole slew of concerns, and changing climate, of course, is specifically related to what we call coastal acidification, which is a little different than ocean acidification. So ocean acidification might be something you've heard about, changes in pH that can be problematic, of course, but in the coastal areas, the addition of nitrogen, specifically coming off the landscape, especially where there is it could be from farms, it can be from septic systems, it can be from fertilizer, it can be from any number of things. And it can exacerbate the acidification issues. And so you do have a different dynamic in a coastal area than you would have in the open ocean. And it has real implications for oysters, which can't set shell if there isn't good water quality, and specifically related to the pH in the water. So it's very challenging, and it's ever changing. And temperature is another part of that as well. So temperature helps the oysters grow, but there's also going to be, and there are already, changes in other sort of biological communities within the watershed related to temperature, and at some point that will have impacts and does already have impacts on
such as
shellfish.
more predators.
Yeah.
The green crabs are the #1 predator for our bottom culture, and because we don't protect the animals on the bottom from the predators.
And disease.
When we started harvesting oysters from the bottom 35 years ago, we would gather in a day a bushel of native crabs, the little, I call them mud crabs, peaky-toe crabs, the inshore upper estuary crabs that aren't very big, but you can take them apart and pick them and eat them for crab salad. Nowadays, we get a dozen of those in a day of harvesting and a bushel of green crabs. And green crabs were brought here 100 years ago from Europe. They're an invasive species. But in the warm temperatures, particularly the warm winter temperatures we've had, we think that the green crabs have survived better in the winter, and there's more of them every year, and they eat not only oysters but clams and other intertidal shellfish.
Yeah.
Mussels, you might think, I used to be able to get down to the shore and pick mussels, and I don't see the mussel beds anymore. And that's probably the result of the green crabs as well.
And Smokey, maybe not an introduced or newcomer on the predation front, but you pointed out something to us at dinner tonight that was on one of our oyster shells.
Yeah. There's another predator that we have for the bottom culture. One year we had a major outbreak and lost probably more than half of a crop. It's called an oyster drill, and it's a small snail about the size of a periwinkle, pointed on both ends, whereas a periwinkle is kind of rounded. And the oyster drill has a rasp-like tongue that literally drills a hole. Sometimes you'll see a shell, a clam shell, mussel shell, oyster shell on the beach with a very small hole, about, 3 millimeters, all the way through the shell. And once the oyster drill goes all the way through the oyster shell, it kills the oyster. So we had a major outbreak about 15 years ago. We still see them. We see the egg casings, which is what we saw tonight at the shuck station. We had a couple of plates of oysters, and I picked up one shell, and it had the eggs of the oyster drill on it. And Sarah and I knew what it was, but the other folks at the table, we quizzed them, and nobody was able to answer the question. So they're a little honey-colored egg sac, and usually there's more than one on each shell. And they don't all hatch, and we don't always see the drills, but they cause a lot of damage.
So, Brendan, all of this is happening in oyster farming, and you are not the first farmer to come into this river. You're faced with a mountain of challenges as you're coming into the river. How was the community of oyster growers as you were starting your farm and starting your business?
Well, it was actually really beneficial growing up here and knowing these guys growing up and just seeing them grow their business, having friends work at Mook or Pemaquid. And I think at the beginning it was tough because there wasn't as much demand and there wasn't as much supply, and it was a new industry, and it was, it was a lot of uncertainty, and there was always going to be those times where it's challenging. And I was lucky enough to come in at a later time and have Smokey beat down that path and really make oysters popular, going to the restaurants and selling it, pitching it to the owners, why a Maine oyster is better than, a Chesapeake Bay oyster. So, I was really lucky to come when I did there. And then I was also lucky to learn a lot from these other oyster farmers. If it takes 3 years to grow an oyster and you make a mistake that first year, that mistake's going to stay with you for the next 2 years. So it's nice to try and limit those mistakes at the beginning and learn from, other people's experience. And I was also able to get a lot of hand-me-down gear. I was a bit of a little scavenger, kind of using people's old discarded gear that, still had some life in it, but they had moved on to a different growing technique, or a boat that needed some pretty heavy fiberglass work. And so, yeah, pretty much all of my gear. I mean, the 2 boats I have right now, 2 out of 3 boats I have right now are from Eric Peters, who owns Norumbega Oysters. So thank you, Eric. And I've definitely gotten used gear from Smokey. So basically what I'm getting at is it's a really strong community, and very lucky to have that. We're all lucky to have that here in this community, because the Damariscotta River is where 70 to 80% of the oysters come from in the state. It's where aquaculture started. It's, the center of it. And I think the way that people are handling here and growing oysters is really leading the industry. And, we have a premium product, and it's something to be really proud of. And I'm lucky to be a part of it and excited for the journey ahead.
Great, thanks. Go ahead, Smokey.
I was just thinking when we started growing oysters, we looked for a market, and our first inclination was to not just to ship them to distributors in New York and Boston, but to look locally to the restaurants as a potential market. So we started knocking on doors, and I had a neighbor who ran a restaurant in Camden, and I brought some oysters to a potluck dinner one night, at the local Grange Hall, and everybody else brought tuna casseroles and hot dogs, and I brought live oysters on the half shell. And Leonard Luckner ran the waterfront restaurant, and he was beside himself. Who brought oysters to the Grange Hall potluck dinner? And I said, well, I did. Where'd you get them? And he said, I could buy these every week. And he was one of my first customers, and I still sell oysters there every week. But after a while, and so we developed a trade selling to the restaurants from, say, Boothbay to Belfast. And after a few years, I thought, well, Portland, that'd be a good market to check out. So I drove down to Portland with some oysters, and I knocked on the doors of every restaurant that I could think of in the greater Portland downtown area. And I identified 10, maybe 12 restaurants and found some interest. And I would go down once a week in my pickup truck, and I'd sell 10, 12, 15 bags of oysters. That was it in the whole town of Portland. There were 10 restaurants that were interested in oysters. Some of them are no longer in business. Some are still going. Now, what do you think? There's probably 50 to 75 restaurants in Portland that serve oysters, and some of them I know serve 5 to 10,000 a week, if not more. So, I mean, it's a completely different thing. And 5 years ago, there was a market study done by the industry to see where we were at. There's more oysters coming up from the farms. Is supply going to meet demand? Is the price going to drop? Is it going to be hard to sell oysters? And they said that in 5 years, this was 5 or 6 years ago, in 5 years, supply would meet demand, and we should expect to see our prices drop. I could sell twice as many oysters as I'm producing right now, every week. So we haven't quite got to that point of supply meeting demand. So keep eating the oysters, folks.
That's right.
They're good for you, too.
So there's a lot of talk, and the river is a busy place, around competing uses and aquaculture sometimes being in the way. Smokey, you shared a story earlier. I'm hoping you could share it again before we have a broader conversation about some of these issues.
Remind me the
Joe
story.
Rigo.
Huh? Oh, Joe Rigo, yeah.
Joe Rigo, yeah.
I don't know. Some of you, I'm sure, know Joe Rigo. He gives striped bass tours of the river, and he's a great fisherman. We sometimes say Joe has X-ray vision. He can see through 20 feet of phytoplankton-filled murky water and identify where the stripers are running. But once a year, Joe will come up to me, and Joe's a good friend. He'll come up to me and say, Smokey, you know, I loved your oyster farm, and your oysters are great and everything, but that's the best striper bass fishing right next to your nursery. And if your nursery wasn't there, I wouldn't get my gear hung up on the bags, and we'd be able to just catch stripers all day. And I said, Joe, the reason that's the best place to fish is because the nursery is there. We have all these bags that are floating on the surface. They're connected to moorings. They're strings of bags. They're off the channel. They're in fairly shallow water. And they provide habitat. Not only habitat for the bait fish, but they collect biofouling, as Brendan was talking about. The river produces great oysters, but it also produces many, many other things. It's a cornucopia of marine stuff. Plants and animals that grow on the cages. So there's plant material growing on the cages. There's also insects, bugs of all sorts. The bugs fall off the cage when we flip them. The small bait fish come in and eat the bugs. They hide under the cages. It provides them with some disguise from the larger fish. And the stripers come in and eat the bait fish. And so it's the best fishing for a reason. And I'm sorry, you know, your hooks get caught on the bags sometimes. When we find them, we keep them and use them to go striper fishing. But anyway, and by the same token, we started bottom planting oysters and dragging oysters. And you know, there's some concern sometimes about, are we disturbing the ecology of the river by running a chain sweep drag across the bottom? A chain sweep drag is a drag that has a heavy chain. It's called a digging chain, and that's what scoops along the bottom. It's not a rake with long fingers that digs into the mud. It just scrapes along the top of the substrate and collects the oysters into the bag. But it does pick up some of the mud in the muddier areas. We farm, our bottom area is in a high current area, so it's pretty well scoured. It's not as muddy as it would be in the sides of the river. But there is some sediment that comes up. But in talking to the scientists who've looked at this, 95% of the sediment drops back down to the river bottom within so many feet of where it comes up. So it replaces itself on the river bottom. But the area that we bottom plant was pretty much barren of animal life. It had a lot of rocks, and we've moved most of the rocks out of the area after 30 some years of harvesting there. But there's more diversity of marine animals on the bottom because the oyster bed is there. People give monoculture has kind of a bad name. If all you're doing is growing oysters, you're displacing all these other things, but actually you're providing habitat. So the horseshoe crabs love our bottom lace, and we kind of see them as cultivators. They kind of go around and plow up around the oysters. And well, the crabs that we don't want to have there. But there's other fish, many more animals are living on the oyster beds than were living there before we planted the oysters there.
You're recreating an ecosystem that was here before. So aquaculture to me sounds like a pretty amazing thing and a great thing for our community, and yet we pay attention to the legislature, and there have been some crazy bills moving through that have been trying to slow down the growth of aquaculture and to kind of tamp down and limit it as an industry on our coast. I'd like each of you, before we turn it over to the audience for questions, to speak a little bit about what aquaculture means to you and why those perspectives that it's growing too fast or doesn't have a place here may not be accurate. So, Brendan, maybe you need a minute, but we can start with you.
So it's a tough question,
Yeah.
but I'm here for it. So what I love about aquaculture is many facets of it. But the first thing I think of is the community, and I think of the people that are drawn to aquaculture. It's educated people that want to work outside, that want to grow food, and in this case, a premier, incredibly healthy food, arguably the most dense, nutrient-dense food in the world, an oyster. So, just a superfood. You're attracting these good people. You're attracting young people. So in case you don't realize it, there's a pretty heavy elderly population here in Maine. I'm not going to ask you to look to your left and then right, but I'm going to say that, we're always trying to attract more young people to the area. And now here in the river, it's well over 100 people working in the aquaculture industry. And that's incredible. And again, just good people being drawn here. I'm lucky enough to have grown up here, so I'm really proud of the area, and I want more people to move here. And I see aquaculture as a great facet for that. We also do a river cleanup each year. I think last year we got almost 2,000 pounds of trash out of the river. All the farms banded together one day and just, had an afternoon of it. And then went to the shuck station and had a couple libations, well-deserved libations. And so, another sense of community there for the greater good, because it's a public good that we're using, and we all recognize that. And we have the best intentions for that. If the public good isn't doing good, not only is our business not going to do good, but our community isn't going to be doing good either. So it's in our complete intention to promote a healthy river and educate the public on all the benefits, the socio benefits, the economic and environmental benefits of aquaculture.
Great.
Good. Sometimes people have asked, I hear often people say, I have nothing against aquaculture, but too much is too much. And so what is too much about it? One of the things that gets brought up is it becomes a hazard to navigation. There's a lot of activity on the river. There's always been a lot of activity on the river. Before there was oyster aquaculture, there was shipbuilding, there was brick making, there was commerce, transportation up and down the river. It was probably a much busier place than 150 years ago, 100 years ago than it is today. There's more recreation on the river today. That's because the water's cleaner. It's a more pleasant place to be. Before the Clean Water Act, a lot of the rivers in Maine, nobody wanted to live on the shore. They all lived away from the water, and the ghettos in the town were built along the rivers. But there's plenty of room to navigate the river. There's good fishing on the river. But also, we've studied the carrying capacity, the biological carrying capacity, and we're not coming anywhere close to using up the phytoplankton. All you have to do is go out and look at the water, and what color is the water in the Damariscotta River? It's dark green this time of year, and that's because of the phytoplankton in the water. We like to have rain and sunshine. The rain brings the nutrients. The sunshine lets the phytoplankton bloom. That's why it's called phytoplankton. And so we've not come anywhere near eating all the our oysters don't eat all the phytoplankton. There's plenty of food for the mussels and scallops and clams and everything else to eat. It's a social carrying capacity that we have to be aware of, and we share the water. So, as Brendan said, we recognize that. Oftentimes, when we site our leases, we talk to the neighbors. We've all set up leases and then adapted where they are, moved them this way, moved them that way, cut a little corner out so it didn't interfere with somebody's egress to their shore property. And so I think it's, you know, the anti-aquaculture forces that have been introducing legislature to the Maine, introducing legislation to the Maine legislature. There's an organization, I'll say their name out loud. It's called Preserve Maine's Fishing Heritage. That's a great idea, right? We all want to preserve Maine's fishing heritage. This organization doesn't do anything to preserve Maine's fishing heritage. They just lobby against aquaculture. But they have a really great name, and I'd like to see them do things to preserve Maine's fishing heritage, and I'd support them 100%. But they think that anything larger than 5 acres is industrial aquaculture. An industrial is a terrible thing to have in the natural environment. And you can't really make a living on less than 5 acres of oysters. And so most of us have larger acreage. My farm has about 20 acres. 18 of those acres are underwater. You don't see the oysters. You don't see, all you see are markers that show where it is. You can go fish in there, you can go swim in there, you can boat over the lease. There's no interference other than some corner markers, which are less than you would find downriver with lobster buoys. So as far as hazard to navigation, not really. So we're aware that we share the resource with the greater community, and we try to be cognizant of that. That's all I'll say.
Yeah, I'll just say that, you know, it's not a surprise that we now are dealing with this carrying capacity, you know, in terms of a social community element. The biological carrying capacity, like Smokey says, is such that we can support a lot more oysters and a lot of other shellfish, according to what the science shows. So that's great. And then we are going to need to grapple with the social carrying capacity, and I'm sure that we're able to do that in a way. You know, I just hope it's done in a way that is understanding. Let's put it that way. I'll just tell you a story. When I started working for the University of Maine, when I first came here to Maine 24 years ago, and I was doing some work in water quality, supporting water quality monitoring projects around the state. And the people I ended up working with were shell fishermen. They were mostly clam diggers, and a number of them were actually where I live in Waldoboro. And I still work with them. They are the most committed individuals to water quality. They will drive, you know, when they're concerned about a pollution source, they will take their sample to UNH if it means they can get DNA samples run on it. And they would pay for it out of their own pockets if they needed to. And I've seen the same here in different ways, that people like Bill Mook of Milk Sea Farm, he's one of the most educated, most aware people about water quality and what it does in the, you know, how the river works, how the estuary works. And, you know, if you want information about the impact of coastal acidification, Bill Mook is one of the premier people to speak to, and in large part, he comes from an educated background, and he also is an oyster grower. And Smokey and I have been out on boats and talked about erosion issues that we've seen and other changes over time, and that's been the case with many other aquaculturists and shellfish-related industry people that I've talked to. So I think that we have a really important component of the community when you talk about protecting water quality and the estuary as a whole in aquaculture industry individuals.
You have to be stewards of the river because it provides your livelihood.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, what a great way to end it. I'll stop being selfish and I'll open it up to questions from the audience.
You'll stop
now.
being shellfish? You'll stop being shellfish?
There we go. I missed an opportunity for a great pun. All right. The first two hands I see, one gentleman in front of another back there in the blue shirt, I believe.
Two questions. One, what is the average temperature the river needs to be in order to produce your oysters the best? The second question is, what gets in the way of you increasing your supply to meet the market?
Did everyone hear that? What temperature is best for growing oysters, and what prevents you from meeting the demand with your supply?
Two good questions. The temperature question is interesting because one of the reasons the Damariscotta River became an epicenter for growing oysters is because it's very warm water. It's 12 miles from the mouth of the river to Damariscotta Village. And that's unusual to find an estuary in Maine that is that large of a body of water 12 miles upstream from the mouth. I mean, there's the Penobscot River and the Androscoggin and so forth, but they have other issues, water quality issues. Damariscotta has a very small watershed. It's Damariscotta Lake and a small area surrounding the lake that is the actual Damariscotta watershed area, right? So there's very little industrial pollution. There's some farm pollution, but not a lot. So the water temperature is very high because of all the mudflats, all the little bays and coves that drain out. Imagine on a hot summer day when the low tide and that mud is exposed and the water comes back in and it heats up to 100 degrees on the mudflat, you know, where it first comes in. And then that water, the Damariscotta has a bottom that's quite uneven, which allows the water to circulate from bottom to top. So there's a lot of vertical integration in the water column. Right now, the temperature at the Schooner Landing Marina is 76 degrees.
Wow.
There's not very many places on the Maine coast that have full tide, nearly full salinity, and temperatures in the mid 70s. This is peak season right now for temperature, so it'll start to drop pretty soon. The little animals, the little oysters, my 2.5 millimeter oysters really like that warm temperature. So I used to think there are only so many places in Maine that you can grow oysters. There's now 150 oyster farms in the state of Maine, and they're not all in the Damariscotta River, thankfully. And they're up and down the coast. They're in Casco Bay, they're in the New Meadows River, they're in Yarmouth, Freeport, they're in the Bagaduce River,
Yeah.
they're in Deer Isle, Mount Desert Island, and further east. And the water temp out on the islands, North Haven Island, Islesboro. Some of those places have salt ponds where the water doesn't exchange 100% each tide. So the water will tend to warm up in a salt pond and you get a little warmer of a temperature. My friend Adam Campbell on North Haven Island has a salt pond where he grows oysters. So he's out in the middle of Penobscot Bay, which is cold water, but the salt pond gets warmer. But people have been growing oysters now in colder water situations, and they have great oysters. They take a little longer sometimes. And sometimes they start with a larger oyster, like Sarah does with the gardening program. You can buy from a larger farm oysters that are 10 millimeters instead of 2.5 millimeters, and they'll thrive in warmer and colder temperatures. But there's more farms further down the river in the Damariscotta, where I used to think it was too cold down there. But there's good oysters being grown there, and it might take an extra year. So it has oysters have a wide temperature ability to adapt. They can grow anywhere from 10 parts per thousand to full salinity, which is about 33 parts per thousand salinity. So temperature, the little ones like the warm temperature. What was the other question?
Second question was, what prevents supply from meeting demand?
Yeah, well, there are more farms, so the supply, I think, is going to inch up in the coming years. So a lot of these new farms haven't been farming for very long, so they're just getting their feet wet and will be producing more. we can grow more oysters in the Damariscotta River. We just have to be cognizant of where we site the leases and keep them, keep the surface leases off to the sides of the channels. There's room downriver. There's room in other estuaries. I think we'll see more oyster farms. I don't think it's stopping at 150. There'll be more oyster farms, and maybe I don't know. There's more people all the time eating more oysters, so maybe we'll never meet the demand.
I count that as a good thing.
Yeah.
There's another gentleman that had a question over there.
Yeah, personally, preface by saying I had Blackstone oysters at Brendan's place today, and I'm sitting right behind the stove, so I'm upset with what I'm saying. Just bear that in mind. But I live on the river, and I've been watching Smokey, do his thing for the last 14 years, never had an issue. But I think the issue for some of us on the river is the proliferation of the on-surface cages, and some of the pictures you had up there show that. And the leases were for like 20 years, which means nobody really can navigate those areas for 20 years. So a couple of questions. What concerns do you have as growers about continuing to add to the surface businesses within the 1 mile from town where we're talking about the quality of water is great for oystering? And there's about 100 acres now that are being used by all those farms, and there's an application now to add another, I think, 20 acres down by Dodge Point. So is there a concern that you have about more sites in that area of the river? And also, how far apart can the various sites be, and how do you pick the site location?
All right, a lot of questions there. I think for everyone, we can focus on what concerns do the growers have about the expansion of aquaculture in the river?
Yeah, I can jump on that one.
In particular, the surface growing.
Yeah, I will definitely jump on that one. Well, yeah, I think you were addressing the close proximity to town. I like to think that's pretty, I don't think you can really squeeze much more there. I think that's pretty well tapped, and I wouldn't be worried about that because the channel's marked, and I would say that that area for sure is, I would say, maxed out. Further south, I can't say to its capacity, and I definitely can't say how much surface area do we want to allocate to growing cages on the surface. It's a question that would take a lot of time this evening, and it's one that is worth having for sure at other meetings. But I would say, the acreage that you were mentioning, a lot of that's on the surface, on the bottom. Like Smokey mentioned, he's got 20 acres right there, and 18 of them are on the bottom. And the 2 acres that he has is off to the side. Whereas I have 10 acres. When I applied for 12 acres, and we had a public meeting, and we came down and we said, all right, let's eliminate some of this. And we did that. I knocked down 25% of my lease and accommodated to the public needs. And then when I had surface gear, I hugged that to a shore of an island to keep it out of the way of boater traffic, being conscious of that. So, we're doing our due diligence there. It also took me 3 years to get this 20-year lease. So, a pretty lengthy process. And in order to even start a business, if you're going to be taking 3 years to get off the ground, I think I'm a pretty stubborn person. And so I think, and determined, and I think that process is due. It should be, lengthy, but it's, we're doing our due diligence. We're working with the state. We're working with environmental engineers, our Army Corps of Engineers, really doing our due diligence in order to get this lease. And I understand that 20 years seems like a scary amount of time, but this industry's been here since, commercial since the early 80s, and we should all be very proud of how it's grown and be, excited for how it's going to grow into the future.
If it takes over 3 years to get the lease, you can't have a 3-year lease. It wouldn't be worth the time spent. But one of the points that the anti-aquaculture forces continually make is that the process must be broken because 80 to 90% of the lease applications that reach the commissioner's office get accepted. And the counterpoint to that is that shows that the process works, because in the course of that process, any problems in the lease applications get ironed out. There are public meetings, there are scoping sessions before the lease application is even submitted to the state. We go to the Army Corps of Engineers, we go to the harbor masters, we go to the DMR,
Riparian owners.
the riparian landowners within 1,000 feet of a lease application can voice their concerns. We have the DMR come out, they dive the lease, they check for any interference with traditional fisheries, which would be clamming or lobstering or what have you. They look for any issues with navigation. So all the problems that get brought up about aquaculture are addressed pretty well in the application process. And the application itself is a small volume that is given to the state by the applicant, with diagrams, with maps, with text that explains the process and why that. One of the questions over here was, how do you choose an area? And that's something that you look at. You're not interfering with traditional fisheries, you're not interfering with navigation. I look for a place that has good temperature, that has good current. That means there's more food brought to the oyster bed. The only thing that I think is missing right now is requirements from the state to have spacing between the leases. There's no, this gets into the weeds, and we don't want to go there tonight, but there's different kinds of permits for aquaculture. There's LPAs and experimental leases and standard leases. And standard leases don't have any buffer zone between them. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed, because we notice within our own 18-acre bottom lease that when the oysters start to become mature to market, the outside of the lease has mature oysters before the inside of the lease. And that's because the inside isn't getting as much food, because it's getting eaten by the oysters that are on the outside of the lease. So if there's another lease below you and another lease above you and another lease to the east and to the west, then we're going to see slowing down of growth. So there needs to be a certain amount of distance between the farms. But
that level of thoughtfulness kind of highlights how aware growers are of their impact on the river, which I think is a great thing. I saw another question over here.
If it takes 3 years to get a lease, how long does it take from that little tiny baby you get until it sits on crushed ice?
2 to 3 years. As little as 18 months, a year and a half to 3 years.
That's a long time for a business to have a product come to the table.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially when you're buying gear and making investments at the beginning. Obviously, trying to be smart about your investments, but you know, you'd like to think. When it took me 3 years before that, it took people a year and a half or 2 years, and then obviously COVID happened and everything kind of slowed down. But the thing is, the DMR is also really understaffed as well, and I think there should definitely be more funding. And some fundraisers or something, somehow to get them some more money, just to be appropriately staffed and not have the kind of turnover burnout of having to deal with angry riparian landowners and fielding phone calls and also dealing with disgruntled, how come it's taking this long? I think there's just certain things that we can do to, make it just a stronger, healthier industry.
There's talk of building moratoriums against aquaculture so that we can find out where we're at. But there's basically a 3-year moratorium on any new site. So it's not like it's happening overnight. It's taking some time for new leases to come into existence.
Also, the Damariscotta is partially, we have a very special designation to Great Salt Bay. It's actually a shellfish protection zone, so It's a legislatively defined area where nobody can do any disturbance of the benthic environment. You can paddle on it, you can fin fish in it, you can go duck hunting, but you can't disturb the benthic environment. And I just think that's a really interesting tool for management overall. A lot of times, like in the other parts of my work, we talk about kind of how to balance different management tools so that, we have both a preserve and a farm, a terrestrial farm, and how do we balance those needs for those, and have lots of wildlife and produce food for people. And I think of this as a bit like that in many ways. We can develop tools to help us protect shellfish and have aquaculture. And I think the Great Salt Bay, it's actually Maine's first marine, it's not really a marine protected area, but it's similar in that it is protecting a resource in a very defined and legislatively approved way that we can utilize, and we all reap the benefits of that because that environment is creating lots of plankton. And it's a beautiful vista to look out on, and it's a really incredible place. So I just want to mention that because it is a unique situation in the Damariscotta that already benefits us all.
Great. I saw another question over here, and then I've been neglecting this side of the room, so we'll go over to Rick afterwards.
Yes, I would just love a little more of a shout out to kind of the water filtration superpowers of the oyster. Just, I don't think anybody can fathom how they can process 50 gallons of water a day or whatever, but if you guys could talk a little bit more about what they're giving us in addition to some yummy food.
Yeah, well, yeah, I've heard anywhere from 25 to 50, a mature oyster, 25 to 50 gallons of water that it filters. And it filters not only the plankton, but it filters everything that is in the water. So it takes the sediment out of the water and puts it back out. So if the oysters are on the bottom, they're taking sediment out of the water and depositing it on the bottom of the river. But I was thinking of something. Oh, I was just going to say, we're talking about the benefits of oysters. Oysters have all the essential vitamins, all the essential minerals. They're high in fatty 3 omega, which is good for the ticker. They're high in protein, low in calories. What's not to like about eating an oyster? And they taste good. Right. Usually things that taste that good aren't good for you, but this is the exception to the rule.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks you guys. This is really illuminating and a lot of the stuff I really appreciate, all this great food. But my question has to do with oysters versus mussels. I know in the history of this river, Ed Myers started the mussel farm back in the 1940s down in Clark's Cove. He seemed to make a good business and profit out of that. What is the relative profitability of the two beasts?
Of mussels as opposed to oysters?
So let me just make sure everyone heard. What is the profitability of mussels as compared to oysters?
First of all, I think Ed, if he were here to answer your question, would disagree that he made a good living growing mussels. I've worked out of Clark's Cove for 35 years, and I spent a lot of time talking to Ed over the years. He taught me a lot. He was the holder of the first aquaculture shellfish license in the state of Maine. And he dabbled with oysters. He grew mussels. He tried everything. He was the first person to ship lobsters in a barrel on trains to the Midwest, and you could buy a Maine lobster bake in a barrel. Imagine that. That he did make money at. In any case, oysters are a more valuable species on the market than mussels. So when we look at growing other shellfish, why don't we grow clams? Well, because even when they're $200 a bushel, they're still only worth 30 cents a piece. Mussels maybe are worth 10 cents a piece. Scallops, we're getting to the point where we're thinking maybe scallops is the next shellfish to be growing, because scallops are, at $25 a pound are pretty expensive for a 16, 20 count bag of scallops. But they're more difficult to grow. They take longer. There's challenges with the technology. The Japanese grow most of the scallops that they eat. We import 90% of our seafood to the United States. 90% of the seafood that we consume as Americans is imported from other countries. So to say there's no role for aquaculture is going to be missing a big point. But mussels aren't as valuable. There is a mussel farm still in Clark's Cove. Pemaquid Mussel Company operates 2 rafts there. They have other sites further east. And Dewey Shellfish has a small mussel farm on the river. We're growing seaweed now in the Damariscotta River too, kelp. And that's a carbon, what do you call
Neutral.
Sequestering.
it? Sequester, right, it sequesters carbon. It's actually more than neutral. I'm not sure I'm answering your question very well, Rick, but.
I think we have time for one more question.
What are the effects of climate change you're seeing currently on your operations, and what are you thinking of how you're planning or trying to plan and adapt to climate change? For a 20-year lease, it's going to look a lot different 20 years to
I want to start
Let me
with
just
that
repeat
one.
the questions first, Sarah.
Yeah.
So Pat is asking, what are the impacts of climate change that the farmers and growers are seeing on the river, and how are they planning and preparing for those? Because a 20-year lease, you're going to see a lot of change in that time.
Yeah, these guys can speak to the farm changes and issues. I just want to point out, so one of the things we do at Coastal Rivers is we monitor the middens. There's a statewide program called Midden Minders, and we're documenting the loss of the middens over time. And we are, in fact, losing these ancient sites, and we are, in fact, seeing erosion that we have not seen before. And that will, that has the potential to impact shellfish, certainly, because if you have sediment in the water, it's changing the water chemistry, and it's decreasing the amount of oxygen that can be in the water and so forth. So that's just one tiny thing that we're seeing that's related. Now, the other thing I just want to mention is that climate change is actually probably largely responsible for the number of people in the auditorium tonight. We have more people in Maine all of a sudden, partly because of COVID and largely because of climate change. And so, I think that there are more people coming here, and so the threats that are out there are different and substantial, and to some degree we're seeing them for sure, and for some degree we will see them in the future. But go ahead and speak to the specific things.
Well, one thing that comes to my mind, as we already said, oysters can grow in higher temperature water, so the heating up of the seawater is maybe not our biggest concern in terms of climate change. But the heating of the air is a concern, and that involves the public safety of harvesting oysters and getting them to market in a responsible way. And there's a bacteria that's naturally occurring in the water called Vibrio. And 25 years ago, it was a concern in the Gulf of Mexico because they have much hotter air temperatures and water temperatures. There's a cold water strain of Vibrio that has found its way both up the Pacific coast and the Atlantic coast. And about 10 years ago, the growers got together on the Damariscotta River and approached the DMR and said, we're concerned about the safety of our product given the Vibrio bacteria and the warmer air temperatures that we're dealing with. What can we do? And so instead of the DMR coming to us and saying, you got to do this, we went to them and said, what do you think we can do to keep our product safe for the consumers? And they helped us draft regulations that we now are required to follow, but we offered in the first place to follow the regulations. And Vibrio increases after oysters or any shellfish, but particularly shellfish that are consumed raw. So quahogs and oysters are the main concern. After the oysters are brought out of the water, at 50 degrees, the Vibrio doesn't increase at all. At 60 degrees, it starts to increase by 50%. At 70 degrees, it increases by 100%. At 80 degrees, it increases by 150%. I'm just throwing these numbers out. I'm not a scientist. At 90 degrees, it goes completely crazy. And Vibrio can cause a severe stomach ache. If you're immune compromised, it can kill you. So it's a serious public health issue. And as growers, we now, in the summer months from June 1st to October 1st, have 2 hours from the time an oyster comes out of the water until it's in our walk-in cooler. And we keep our cooler at 35 to 37 degrees. And we monitor, we have records that show that the oysters were brought to the cooler in less than 2 hours. And we are also required to monitor the temperature of the oyster as it drops in the cooler. In under 3 hours, the temperature of the oyster has to be under 50 degrees. So we have, you can come to my shop and I'll show you reams of paper that record these temperatures and times. And we've reduced greatly the number of Vibrio illnesses that have happened in Maine. In other places, they've shut estuaries down. For the FDA comes in and says there's been 3 cases of Vibrio here, and so you're closed for harvesting shellfish until November. And in the Damariscotta River, that would throw 100 or 150 people out of work, and the restaurants would not have oysters. And, so it's a very serious health concern, and we take it very seriously, and we hope that the consumers do too. The restaurants are responsible for the oysters after they get them. Our wholesalers are responsible for keeping the oysters safe. And you as consumers, if you come to our store and buy oysters to take home, we make sure you go away with a bag of ice on your oysters. Even if you're driving 10 minutes to Round Pond, I don't want you out, I don't want a bag of oysters in the back seat of your car in 90-degree weather. So you're responsible once you take possession of the oysters, and you need to take it as seriously as we do. So that's one of the climate change issues in my mind.
Well, Sarah, Smokey, Brendan, it sounds like a lot of work. We're awfully glad you're doing it. So let's give our panel a round of applause.
Thanks, Sam.
So with that, thank you all so much for joining us. I would encourage you, if you are not a member of the theater or the Island Institute, find us so we can support the great work that these folks are doing on the water and great experiences like this. And if you want to wear something to show your appreciation, come find me and talk to us about our Real Mother Shuckers t-shirts. So on that shameless sales pitch, thank you all so much for joining us this evening.